We begin with a conflict scene. Utilizing See You Later, Caspar reappears on the scene behind your sensei. Tristan rushes towards Caspar.
Sensei, look out!
Your sensei turns just in time to block an overhead swing from Caspar with a dagger. With a twist of his foot and rotation of his torso, your sensei lands an uppercut in the gut of Caspar, dropping him to his knees.
Damn you! Stop with these antics, Caspar. You were once my finest apprentice, and now you bring shame to the name of Cog's Hollow. Do you think that I would ever let you take me down? You, a pathetic old man, and an excuse for a protector.
Caspar pulls himself to one knee, wrestling something from inside the cuff of his robe. He quickly puts it to his lips and turns the bottle upside down, drinking what appears to be a liquid. Immediately, Caspar gags and coughs, falling over writhing in pain. After a few moments of agony, the contorted body of Caspar begins to swell. Growing in size, the fiber of clothes can be heard ripping and skin tearing. With his newfound abilities, Caspar turns to your sensei and transforms him into a soul treasure with his soul steel technique.
Sensei!
Holding up the soul treasure, Caspar turns to Tristan with a smirk.
I suggest you don't try and follow me, or you might end up like your precious sensei.
Caspar pockets the soul treasure and vanishes once more as Tristan rushes towards him.
Welcome in, Shield Brothers and Shield Maidens, to Shield's Rest. I'm Brown, and I'm joined here by Fry, and today we're going to be continuing our dive into Fabula Ultima. If you haven't gotten a chance just yet, please go back and look at Chapter 1 and 2 so that this one will hopefully make a little bit more sense to you. But today we're going to be talking about Chapter 3, Core Mechanics, and we're going to start with conflict basics.
For conflict, first let's kind of like define what a conflict scene is. So this is any, chase, battle, even debates that are particularly important. You want to save these for kind of truly dramatic moments. Not every encounter needs to necessarily be a conflict. You can kind of handle them with the checks and clocks most of the time. Your aim for conflict in particular should be about every maybe 2 hours of play, right? So not everything is going to be boiled down, zoomed in onto a conflict scene. You should be using them when the narrative needs it to be done. For the structure of a conflict and like what that kind of looks like, there are a couple steps in the book, and we'll kind of just briefly go over them. First, you're going to determine who is participating in the scene. That includes both player characters and non-player characters. Whoever is not in that scene kind of just fades into the background. So they're there, but you're not going to necessarily reference them within the scene or call them out and have them help, so to speak. You do determine who's participating in that conflict first, and then everyone else is just, like I said, fading into the background. However, if you do need them to join a scene, they can enter at the end of a round, which I'll get into in just a little bit, but that's who is there in the beginning. Then you also want to discuss the goals of the participant. So obviously the antagonists, you as the GM, know what their goal is. Doesn't necessarily have to be announced to the party, as the GM, but maybe you want to announce it. Maybe they want to monologue a little bit, but at least the PCs and the NPCs on their side should determine what their goal is for the conflict, because not every conflict needs to end, especially if it's a combat. It doesn't have to end in true defeat or, destroying your opposition, right? You could be like, hey, I want to get them until they surrender, or hey, I want to do this fight until everybody has escaped the building, right? It's you're determining what is the end of the conflict, not necessarily until you're the last man standing, even though that may be the case. Then make a initiative group check. So this is a dexterity and insight roll. For this, since it is a group check, you will determine the leader. This will be who makes the final check. Everybody else just has a difficulty level of 10 check on theirs to see if they add that bonus to his check, the leader's check. And then the difficulty level for the leader is just beating the highest initiative check from the adversary side. So they'll roll their initiative checks, say they get a 17. That is what the leader for that group check has to beat to win the initiative. Also, when you're rolling the initiative, you'll add your initiative modifier. That is by default 0. And the only thing that will change that or lower it is the armor that you choose, which again, we'll get into a little bit later, but armor is the only thing that's going to determine your initiative modifier for Fabula Ultima. And then if the leader succeeds, your side gets to go first every round. And if the leader fails, the adversary gets to go first every round. For the rounds and turns, the rounds are just alternating between the PCs and the enemies. So there is no set initiative order. You're just, whenever you win that initiative roll, say you win, your side gets to go first, then they have a combatant, and then one person on your team goes, and then the enemy goes, and you just go back and forth, back and forth. And then once you get to the end, that is when the turn is over. And if there is a disproportionate amount of people on each side, say you have 3 PCs, 5 NPCs, you'll alternate until you can't alternate anymore. And then the NPCs would just finish out their turn. So it'd be PC, NPC, PC, NPC, PC, and then NPC, NPC, NPC. They'll just finish out there. So numbers do have a little bit of advantage at the end because they kind of go back to back, but that's how that alternating initiative goes. The end of the conflict is determined ultimately by the GM, and that is whether the goal or objectives are achieved. Only one side is kind of remaining standing. So if you have maybe 3 or 4 kind of interacting sides, once that final side is the last one standing, so to speak, that would also be the end. Or if you have a compromise, if in the conflict you decide you want to kind of barter with the other side to see if you can come to an agreement, that can end it as well. So it isn't encouraged to not necessarily uh, just pummel, the enemy to the ground, and that's how you win. There are multiple ways to it, and that's because you're establishing those objectives at the beginning of the conflict. As far as the movement in this game is concerned, the space and the distances and all that you can move, there is no set distance tracking, so to speak. It's assumed that, especially for your allies, you can always reach your allies. You can always reach other creatures as well, unless there is something specifically trying to stop you or getting in your way, whether that be enemy combatant getting in your way if you're trying to get across the battlefield, or if there's maybe a big terrain situation that you're not able to get across. Those are the only things that are going to stop you from getting there. Otherwise, it's assumed you can always make it to whatever target you're trying to get to. There is no tracked spaces or distances number wise in this game here. As far as your melee and ranged is concerned, so are melee and ranged weapons, all that is really there for is to determine interactions with skills, because some skills will only work with melee weapons, some will only work with ranged weapons. So there's no melee is within 5 feet or range is up to 100 feet, things like that. Those are only there to determine whether a skill interacts with that ability, or if you're facing a creature that is described as flying or elusive. So that means you have to have a ranged weapon because they are not on the ground. There's no way to physically reach them. That's basically the conflict scene in a nutshell, right? It has some a little bit of guardrails on to describe what you can and can't do very loosely, but so there's not a lot of distance space tracking. It's all very goal and narrative oriented. You're determining as the players what your goals are and what you want to get out of a conflict, and that kind of determines the win-lose condition, so to speak. So it's very open to interpretation, and it's very PC forward as far as what you want to accomplish in this conflict. But I will go ahead and throw back to Mark to tell you what those actions can be in conflict to get to your goal.
So the book, there are 10 actions that are listed, and I'll just quickly say those. It's attack, equipment, guard, hinder, inventory, objective, spell, study, skill, and other. That's a lot. We're going to try to cover each one of them here, but we'll start with attack. Essentially, there are 4 steps to attack, which you would, again, back to our other chapters, this book lays out steps for you for almost everything. That was pretty self-explanatory. So for an attack, the first step is to choose your target. Then you perform that accuracy check. You determine any damage that might happen from your attack. And then you add in any other modifiers, such as if they have a weakness or things of that nature. There are also different types of attack. So one of the first ones is the free attack. Some specific skills may say perform a free attack, and that's just what it sounds like. It's a free attack. It doesn't require an action or anything like that. So you, in effect, could have multiple attacks in one turn. Free attack, I wanted to give an example of each one. So for the rogue, one of their free attack skills is called high speed. Throw that up on the screen. And then you also could have multi-attacks, which sounds like what it is. It's where you hit more than one target with your attack. The sharpshooter has a skill called Barrage, for example, that lets them hit additional targets and potentially even more than two. It could be three or higher, depending on how they use that ability. And also, you have two weapon fighting. Used an example for a gunslinger, for example. Let's imagine they have two pistols. Uh, the only difference with Fabula Ultima with two weapon fighting is that you don't add in your high roll. So in most weapons, you would add your high roll plus whatever damage for that weapon. But when you're using two weapon fighting, you lose that high roll option off of there. So there's still a penalty, so to speak, just like you would see in Dungeons and Dragons or other games where maybe you don't add in your strength bonus. Next up, you have the equipment action, and this is pretty basic. It's the action that you're going to take when you want to store equipment into your backpack or rearrange equipment. If you wanted to do that in a conflict scene, for example, it would take your whole action to rearrange items in your backpack. Armor is the one thing that's listed in the book that you can't actively take off or put on during conflict. There's just not enough time. Armor is a bulkier, heavier thing that takes more effort to put on. But a lot of things like potions or stowing a weapon, things like that, you can use the equipment action. We also have the guard action, which this one's pretty cool. I like this one a lot because not only do you gain resistance to all damage types, you also gain a +2 bonus against opposed checks. And the most fun part is that you can cover another creature, which means they can't be targeted by melee attacks until the start of your next turn. So you're basically making yourself more resilient and also able to protect someone else, which I think is really cool, especially when it's just simplified into an action that anyone can take. Now, obviously, some classes will be better at that, but still very useful in certain situations. The next action is the hinder action. This one's really cool as well. You perform a check with a difficulty level of 10. If you surpass that, then you succeed and you get to inflict a status on your target, which could be either dazed, shaken, slow, or weak. And we might get into what those actually do or mean later. But pretty cool that you can use your action to specifically target someone to try to put that status on them. I can just think of all the ways that would be useful against certain enemies or villains that you might be fighting. The next action is inventory action. This is to produce an item from your inventory and use it in one action. An example here is to give your allies a potion or use a damage dealing item. Let's say you have some kind of, a TNT or dynamite and you're throwing it to the enemy. That would be an inventory action, not an attack action, for example. We also have the objective action, which anyone can take. The book, again, gives us a step process for this. There are 3 steps for an objective action. However, the main goal of it is to make progress towards a goal during conflict. So if there's a clock or a timer, you can use your objective action to help progress that versus attacking. You also have the spell action, just what it sounds like. You can cast spells that you have learned, and we'll get into spells a little bit later, so I'm not going to go too heavy on that. You also have the study action. This is your ability to check an enemy or a villain and see what they're capable of, maybe. Use an open check, performing with your insight plus insight. So this is one of those double skill rolls you would use. And then you determine based on the difficulty level if you are successful in that study and you're able to glean or gain information about your target. Next, we have the skill action. This is required whenever something says use an action. So there are specific things that will say use an action. Then you would use the skill action versus an attack action. And other actions, pretty self-explanatory as well. This is just any action that doesn't fit into a previous category. The book does specifically mention that the GM has a lot of discretion there, but most things are going to fall into one of these other, 9 actions. So very seldom use the other action, but that's pretty much just a catch-all from what I got from the book. Teamwork is where you're able to assist another player character during a conflict scene. That turns their check into a group check, wherein you would be rolling to see if you beat the difficulty level and then potentially adding to their check. Now, with all those actions available to you, I also did want to jump back and tie this into what Fry first talked about with conflicts. So there are some optional conflict rules that the GM or the table could agree to use. With that, all of these conflicts will probably result in somebody taking damage. So I'll let Fry talk about taking and dealing damage.
So first, let's start with kind of like the main resources for that. So your hit points, right? Hit points in this game work pretty similarly to every other game. The only difference being kind of what happens at different health thresholds. You have your, your current hit points. That's just whatever your hit points are currently at. You have your maximum hit points. These are the amount of hit points that your character maxes out as, and you cannot go past those during like any given moment or time. Obviously when you're leveling up and stuff, it'll increase, but in the moment, your max HP is just where it stops, right? Then you have your 50% hit point threshold, and this is called crisis. This is important to know just because there are certain, effects, abilities, skills, things like that that will have different effects or will be usable while in that crisis mode. So it's just important to note what your crisis mode is. Just whenever you increase your HP, just on your character sheet, make sure you're writing down where your crisis threshold is, just so you're tracking that for any kind of abilities. And there are some effects in game that'll happen that'll say reset your health to crisis threshold, stuff like that. So just make sure you're monitoring that. Then you also have your mind points. So this is basically typical mana points, right? This is just what you'll use to cast your spells. But once you run out, you cannot cast any more spells, and you always have to have the minimum amount for the spell, right? So if the spell says you need 9 mind points and you only have 8, things like that, you have to have the exact amount. There's no way to push and try and like get a half effect or anything like that. But once you're at 0 mind points, there's no negative effects or anything like that. There are some negative effects, obviously, at 0 HP, which we'll get into a little more later. But for mind points, once you're out, you're just out until you're able to regain those through resting or taking item, things like that. Into the damage itself. So we'll throw it up on the screen there. There are several damage types, and it's just important to know what type you are dealing for any vulnerabilities and things like that, and to track your own vulnerabilities. So leading into damage affinities. So damage affinities are just certain conditions that will affect the damage being done to enemies and done to yourself as well. First, you have vulnerability. So if you are dealing with a vulnerability to a damage type, you will lose double HP. So if you're vulnerable to fire, you take some fire damage. So you would take normally 10, you'll take 20 instead. If you have resistance to any damage, so you'll take half HP loss. So if you're supposed to take 5 or 10 of that fire damage, you'll take 5 instead. Then immunity, of course, this supersedes resistance and vulnerability. So whatever is affecting that damage type, so to speak, if the target has immunity to that damage, they will just suffer no HP loss. And then most interesting is the absorption affinity. So this means it supersedes all other affinities, of course. You do not suffer HP loss, and instead you recover HP equal to that damage type. So it's very important to figure out what you're fighting if you're fighting something that has an absorption, to track the damage and make sure you're not letting it get any source of that damage, because they will be healing instead of taking the damage. And of course, you can improvise damage. So this is for things like traps and environmental damage, something like that. As always, there is a chart to help you in the book there, but basically these will still follow all the same rules. There's just some thresholds depending on what level you are. It recommends minor, moderate, and major damage. These should never kill a PC, right? That should never be the intent of those. And even if they drop you to 0, they follow the same rules as dropping to 0, which we'll get into a little bit. But just know that these improvised trap damage are not there to kill a PC unless they themselves decide that it will kill them, for story reasons and things like that. But just little ways to chip out the players there. And this just falls under improvised damage. It's not a specific damage type or anything like that. And then we'll round that out with status effects. So Brown had touched on these a little bit on here, and I'll expand on it a little bit. But these are, again, there's a chart in the book which we'll throw up, but these are going to affect your attribute die. So depending on what you have affecting you, it's going to just reduce that attribute die by 1 size. So say you are dazed, it's going to take your insight die, say it's a D8, it'll take it down to a D6. If it's a D12, it'll take it down to a D10, so on and so forth. And you have some that will affect too. So you have poison. This affects both might and willpower, and it'll drop both of those dies down by 1 size. And then if you have different effects that affect the same attribute, they will stack. So say you are dazed and enraged, your insight die will drop by 2 sizes instead of just the 1. However, it has to be different effects. You can't be dazed twice and it drop down 2 times. It has to be 2 different effects. So if you have 2 sources of being dazed, you just reduce the die size by 1. Those don't stack. They have to be 2 different effects. So these are recovered by resting or some spells, skills, items, things like that will allow you to remove those conditions as well. But resting will always get rid of those status effects there. And the status effects, are an abstract representation, right? That could be things like once you're drunk or sick, now you're poisoned, you have that poisoned effect on you. Or maybe you're going through a tunnel, cave, anything like that, has something sticky, oozy, uh, getting your feet stuck like that, that could apply the slow condition as well. So status effects are not always just side effects of maybe spells or things like that. It could just be represented through the narrative itself. I will now throw it back to Brown, who's going to tell you what happens when all these effects and damage types finally take you to 0 hit points and you must face the brink of defeat.
Yeah, you die and just make a new character. No,
Yeah.
I'm joking. So actually, I kind of like what Fabula Ultima does here, and again, it splits it into categories, which I thought was very helpful. But we'll start first with a non-player character, so your NPCs, and it kind of was a joke, but like Fry just said, the GM kind of has discretion here because they know the importance of the NPC. If they want to kill them off or they die at 0 HP, then that's what happens. However, you can capture them, they can flee, they can become unconscious. So there are different ways based on the NPC that would be in pretty much every other tabletop role playing game, right? Within the GM's discretion. Now, when it comes to villains, they only have two options. It's either escape or surrender. So if it's a villain, think like the BBEG. They aren't normally just hit zero and die off because in Fabula Ultima, it's all about the narrative and the fantasy, right? That villain is supposed to go throughout the arc or the campaign. And so there's actually some cooler things that you can do with the villains that I'll let Fry touch on later. But escaping and surrendering are kind of the two main things. Now they can use their Ultima points to do some cool stuff, but I'll leave that. For player characters, they either sacrifice themselves, like in a Blaze of Glory kind of thing, or they can also surrender. I'm going to cheat with the book here a little bit. For example, you can only sacrifice yourself if at least two of the following things are true. There has to be a villain on the scene. Your sacrifice benefits a character you have a bond with, or you believe your sacrifice would make the world a better place. So, two of those things. Doesn't seem like it's too hard to meet those, but essentially that's how you would sacrifice yourself, and yes, your character would die. The other thing is to surrender. So this would mean that you fall unconscious. You can no longer act or affect the scene. You can't use any abilities. It's your typical unconscious, right? The game master cannot kill a character if they choose to surrender, but he can impose a consequence on them from a list below, right? And there's a lot of these. I'll just throw them out. But darkness, despair, loss, resentment, and separated. So that's pretty, you're no longer with your allies and you might be captured, dragged away, lost. So the GM can do a lot of cool stuff here with really any of these categories that hit 0 HP. It's not simplified down to just, yep, they're dead and they're gone out of the campaign forever. So I did think that was very interesting how they lay it out in this book for pretty much every mechanic, but this specifically, like that's 2 pages of what to do when you hit 0 HP, right? Definitely much cooler and a lot more things you can do. But with that, we'll touched on the Ultima points a little bit, so I'll let Fry talk about both Fabula and Ultima points once more and what they can do and how those affect the story and also the mechanics of the game.
I do want to touch on that too. I do love the 0 HP mechanics. It's especially if you're to ever afraid to kill off your characters, right? Nobody wants to kill off their NPCs, so I love that they have
Yeah, nobody wants to
numerous
do that.
options. Yeah,
I,
to keep them alive. It's the opposite of that old school Dungeons and Dragons where it was basically a meat grinder, right? This is
yeah,
doing everything it can to keep your PCs there. So I like the flip side of that. But
for sure.
yes, into the two big resources, right? It's in the title of the game, the Fabula points and the Ultimate points. First, we'll start with the Fabula points. So these are the player focus uh, points that you can spend on the game, right? Every character starts with 3 at character creation, and then as far as gaining more of them, there are a few options. If you ever start the session with 0 Fabula points, you'll immediately gain 1. If you ever roll a fumble, that PC will gain a Fabula point as well. So like I said, nat double ones here aren't always a bad thing. You at least get something out of it. Whenever the villain makes an entrance during the scene, including GM scenes, you will gain all PCs will gain a Fabula point. So whenever you have those GM scenes where it's just kind of describing what the villain is doing off screen, as soon as you see that villain pop up, you immediately get a Fabula point for your entire team. So like that, you still get a little bit of bonus even if you're not there. And whenever a player surrenders at 0 HP, they'll gain 2 Fabula points. So again, you lost, you might suffer some consequences there, but you'll get a couple Fabula points out of it to hopefully flip the scale back into your favor later on. And then whenever a player invokes a bond or trait to automatically fail a check, which is an optional rule that you can use in the game if you want to for the narrative, uh, fail a check because of a bond or a specific trait that your character has that just fits the story and you feel like, no, I should fail this because XYZ, you'll at least gain a Fabula point out of that as well. And then to spin the Fabula point, you use these to kind of alter the story. This is where you get to kind of make a statement that reshapes the world, so to speak, affects the peoples and creatures in it, and kind of fill in the gray areas of the story and to introduce, those great plot twists, right? Like the villain is unmasked and you find out that it's your long lost brother, right? You can spin a Fabula point to make that true. There are some rules to that, though. First is if you're going to change or add new details to a character, location, or item that has already been established in the story, you just have to have the GM's permission, right? You don't get to override the GM necessarily if you want to change, the location of an item, so to speak, like that. GM still has to permit it. And if you want to affect another PC, for example, say you want to say that they have a bounty on their head or the villain is actually their brother or something like that, right? You do need that PC's permission as well. So you can't override anything that is extending past your character. You still need permission from everybody involved. And you cannot use this to contradict any previous statements made by either yourself or another participant. So, uh, no examples right off the top of my head there, but right, you can't somebody establish one thing and you're like, well, I want to spend my Fabula point to make that wrong or a lie. You can't do that. You can't
Yeah, no takes and
remove any
backsies.
previous statements. However, you could kind of change yeah. You just you can change the framing of information. You just cannot change the actual information itself. You can just kind of maybe reveal a detail about it, but not change the truth of it. And then you also cannot change any mechanics, right? You can't gain a skill, you can't change a vulnerability in either yourself or an enemy or things like that. Those are always at GM discretion. If they want to allow it, you can make it make sense in the narrative, great, but you cannot force a mechanical change on the game. And then if you want to introduce an NPC, say you want to, he's not the villain, but you run into a village and you found your long lost brother and he was just a blacksmith at the village, right? He is still under the GM control. You don't just gain this ally that runs around in the party now. The GM still determines all that stuff. But those are the kind of rails for Fabula points. Other than that, you use this to kind of generate personal investment into the story and to kind of change it into maybe your favor or to just something more fun that you think is interesting. But you can also spin them to invoke a bond. So whenever you want to invoke a bond and add that bond strength to a check, you spend a Fabula point. And if you ever want to invoke a trait, and that allows you to re-roll dice during a check, that costs a Fabula point as well. And then there are also certain skills that will require Fabula points to spend. So a lot of ways to gain it, a lot of ways to spend it as well.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to interrupt you. I really love the Fabula points because what I've been trying to do more as I play role playing games, right? Tabletop role playing games is actually invest in the role play at the table, invest in the other characters and your own character to really make that story, special. And so I really love the Fabula points because any system that specifically has something like this, like a resource you can use to, you know, empower you to role play. I just think that's super great. Like you were saying, like the villain's unmasked, and that's my brother. That's so cool that you can, you want to think of a way to use these points. You don't want to just hold on to your 3 Fabula points you started with and never use them. And so I think this is a great way to empower people to bring that into the story. So
Yeah, and it's almost an unlimited resource because the 3 is just what you start with. There is technically no cap that I saw. So, I mean, yeah, horn if you need to, but like spin them because you're going to be gaining them. I'm sure rolling, fumbles, surrendering. I'm sure will happen. The villain should be popping up, fairly frequently. So spend them as you get them. I'd probably be trying to use at least one a session, if not two.
yeah, I'm
But
sure you'd find a way to use them all. By
yeah,
the end of every
yeah,
session, you'd be at 0.
I want to be a 0 so I can get my free one next time. So,
Yeah.
but that does lead us to the mirror, the dark mirror of Fabula points, the Ultima points. So these are what the villains have. The villains are the powerful antagonists, right? Not everybody is a quote unquote villain. A villain is a title given to your basically your BBEG of the arc or the campaign, the story that you're trying to tell. The villain has Ultima points. It has a little chart in there, but I'll go over it briefly. You have minor, major, and supreme villains. So your minor villains, they come with 5 points, and kind of think of these as like city level threats, right? Like if you're in the city, they're maybe trying to take over the city, get that maybe that mayor spot right, so they can start doing some political damage, things like that, or maybe they're trying to overtake the guards and things like that, flip people to their side. These are your city level threats. Then you have your major villains. These come with 10 ultimate points, and these are affecting countries, right? These are countrywide threats. Maybe they have a established army, and they're just trying to take over countries and take over land and things like that. Those are your major villains. And then, of course, you have your supreme villains. These come with 15 ultimate points, and these are world level threats. They are trying to dominate, take control, rule the world. These are your big BBEGs, right? And how they spin these ultimate points. They have a couple different ways, but first I will say the ultimate points for them do not recharge like they do for the PCs. Once they spend their ultimate point, that ultimate point is gone until they hit 0, with a little bit of caveat, which we'll get into. But how they spend them is mainly 3 ways. They can escape a scene, and that is just allows them to safely leave the scene. Saying maybe you were finally able to kind of back them into a corner, or it's gotten to a point in the plot, in the scene, the conflict, where they're like their backs against the wall and they don't have a way out. They can spend that ultimate point to narratively escape the scene, maybe leave some foes behind for them to deal with, right? They can also invoke a trait, which is the same way that the players will use it. Villains have traits as well, so the same thing. They can spend an ultimate point to invoke a trait to reroll a check, and then they can also use it for the ability recovery. So this will allow them to recover from all status effects, clear any status effects they have on them, and recover 50 mind points. So they don't recover health from it, but they do get their mind points back for more spells and like that. All of these just cost 1 point. Once they've used all their ultimate points and you finally defeat them, they can do, which I love this, they can do what's called escalation. They can escalate. So while they cannot recharge their ultimate points, they can escalate once you've defeated them. Maybe you've offered them the chance at redemption, right? You want them to grow, you've defeated them, you showed them the error of their ways, and they have just chosen to reject that. They double down on their resolve for whatever conflict, whatever their purpose is, and they evolve. Like we had in our kind of intro scenario there with Caspar. He was backed into a corner, he was defeated, and he decided to double down and grow in power. So what this does is it moves them up a grade. So a minor villain becomes a major villain becomes a supreme villain. Supreme villains cannot grow. So once at the Supreme, that is your chance to finally defeat them if you are, bumping them up every time. They're treated as an entirely new villain. Their ultimate points will reset to their new value. So if they went from minor to major, they spent their 5, they've grown, and they've just gained 10 more ultimate points. This happens as soon as they arrive on scene, right? So if you're in the fight with them and they escalate, they are a new villain and they immediately gain their ultimate points right there. However, you do gain your fabula points as well because a new villain has arrived on the scene. So again, always a little silver lining on these things. Whenever something bad happens, you do get some fabula points to try and turn it around. But I love this. Just like the fabula points, I think the ultimate points are great because it's a way to keep a villain recurring, uh, especially if you've run into the point where you didn't plan accordingly and your PC's kind of stomped your BBG. Well, I want to keep him around. We're going to evolve him, make him stronger, and bring him back in. So I love it. Love this one. And then to wrap up our resource pool, we do have, like Brown was saying earlier, our inventory points. These are used to create items from our inventory. So it's kind of our reserve of useful gear and consumables that we have in our backpack that are not necessarily counted item by item. You default to 6 inventory points, and then some classes and skills will increase that limit. But you spend inventory points from a item from the inventory list, which we'll throw up on there. And you just say, hey, I need a potion. Actually, I want to use a healing potion. Spend your inventory points. Boom, you pull one out of your backpack. All the points must come from the same character. So if you have one, another character has one, you can't spin them both together to get a 2 inventory point item. It does have to all come from you. and then you recharge them by spending Zenit, which is the money in this game, whenever you're back in town to restock on those inventory points. And so it's just a way to have those kind of quick consumables without actually micromanaging and tracking them individually. You just have this resource pool that when you want to use it, you just kind of pull them out and spend the points there. But that's our resource pool in a nutshell, the big main ones that you're going to be using along. Next, we're going to get into a little bit of magic, flip it up a bit, and some special abilities, which I'll let Brown kind of swap and take over and tell you of what you can do with that.
For sure. And can I just say that I love the inventory points? I think I said that in the other video, but that's really just a way to like stop the story from like slowing down because you don't have something available or you're out of potions. This is a way to just kind of fuel the narrative, right? So I love that that's like a flex resource you can have.
Also, I was like, I always hated that. Like when you're in a game, I was like, man, do I have a healing potion? And you're like looking through your notes and all that. Man, did I give it
You
to
didn't
you?
write
Did I
it
give it to him? I
down.
was like,
Yeah.
just spend the points and be like, yeah, I'm gonna just do it. So
I feel like I know I got
that,
6 potions, but I don't remember who had which potion.
yeah,
Everybody's got it now or can get it. Yeah, so I'll just say for magic and special abilities, like there's a lot to go through for magic. So if this is not in depth enough, please let us know. But there are essentially two types of spell casting in this game. There are spells, which are your more like during combat, conflict scenes, those kind of things. And then there are rituals. Think of your rituals as like your caster's natural ability to manipulate magic, right? And so with magic, there are 6 different disciplines. That's arcanism, chimerism, elementalism, entropism, ritualism, and spiritism. The only one that's kind of stands out as ritualism is available to all of the classes except for the arcanist. The arcanist can't do ritualism related things. And I'll throw a chart in here as I talk that will help you understand what those disciplines are if I didn't already show it. But depending on what type of discipline you are, depends on which dice you use to make the check. But most of these, if not all of them, actually all of them, spells do require a magic check, and you use whatever your discipline is to cast that spell. We will go into for spells. Again, this book, love it, gives you 6 steps to casting a spell. Much like the attack, though, it's kind of straightforward. So the first step is to declare which spell you want to use. Has to be one that your characters learn, as I mentioned before, and what effect it hopes to achieve. If you require, you should choose a target, right? Some spells don't require you to pick a target, most of them do. And you can, step 3, perform the magical gestures or pronounce the formula. And any creatures nearby will see and hear you. I'll kind of jump to this right now, but in this system, you cannot cast magic secretly. It is known to everyone. You have to say something or be moving in some way, and the magical energy as it erupts from you is obvious to everyone. It's not something that can be hidden. Also, for step 4, you have to spend the required mind points, which, again, depending on the spell, requires a certain amount of mind points. I'll use an example for Ignis. It's one of the offensive spells. It requires 10 mind points per target, and you can choose up to 3 creatures. So you could spend anywhere from 10 to 30 mind points to use Ignis. It's also an instant damaging spell, and it does high roll plus 15 fire damage. So that's an example of that spell. Let's see here. For elementalism, entropism, and spiritism, those checks rely on insight plus willpower. So that's what you would roll to make your magic check. However, chimerism relies on insight plus willpower or might plus willpower, depending. Non-offensive spells are automatically successful, require no check, and fumbles and critical successes still apply to magic checks. And also, for example, back to Ignis, if you do roll a critical, then the opportunity effect happens, which makes each target hit by the spell suffer the shaken status. So I think that's really cool that the spells are, there's like a base level, then you can kind of flex if you want to choose more targets or not. And then you can, kind of manage your mind points based on that. And then if you happen to crit, it's got that extra effect on there. So I think the spell casting in this game, while it's basic in nature, like in most systems, there's a lot of extra stuff in there that you can benefit from and play off of that can also help drive the narrative, right? And then step 6 is to apply the effects of the spell. So a lot to unpack there. If the same spell is cast more than once on a target, the effect does not stack. So whatever the most recent casting was replaces the first one. And there's a little chart in here as well about describing your magic. This is basically just saying that it's your magic. You can make it look like and describe it how you want to. So a druid or a witch might use magical branches and blossoms of fruit. A spellblade would channel magic through blade movements. So you can flavor your magic based on your character and how you see them or play them. Now to dive into the other side of magic, which is rituals. This is quite a bit. So there's that chart again. But there are certain things that rituals cannot do. So they cannot cause direct damage. They cannot inflict or remove status effects. They cannot cause characters to lose or gain any of their resources, such as HP, MP, IP, Fabula points, etc. They can't be used to replicate mechanical benefits, such as replacing a skill or anything like that. And they cannot generate creatures or equipment or grant them permanent abilities. So rituals, like I said, are that all other magic, but there's limitations to it. There are many charts in here for rituals that I'll try to explain, but basically there are 3 steps for a ritual, 4 if it's during a conflict scene, but the initial 3 steps are you describe what you want to accomplish and declare which ritual you're using and what area you want it to happen in and what creatures it will affect. So that is called the area and the potency, and there's charts. The normal procedure requires a magic check and must exceed the difficulty level based on the ritual's potency. Again, reference that chart. And the check relies on attributes, which are indicated by the discipline that you would be required to use, which I've already shown, but I'll show that again. There's also an option to do rituals as group checks. So much like the group check works initially, other players can help you even if they don't have any magical capability, right? Like take a Fury, for example. They're just a fist-fighting person. They don't have any magical prowess. They can still initiate the group check with you in your ritual to help you accomplish that goal. Same rules apply. They do a check, and if they beat the difficulty level, then they add a bonus to it. You can also reduce the cost of a ritual. However, you have to use a rare or powerful ingredient, right? So maybe you could pull in some inventory points or just find that along the way in the story. But there are ways to reduce the cost of a ritual. I'll just throw one example of a ritual out there to help it stick because I had to read this a few times. But for example, you can erect a barrier of energy to shield a castle from an avalanche. That would be considered a ritualism spell. That would be considered a ritualism ritual. And it's an extreme potency, right? Because there's a vast amount of magic it's taking. And the area would be huge because you're protecting an entire castle. However, with rituals, there's a downside because if you fail, for example, you're trying to protect that castle. If you fail, you could cause a burst of uncontrolled magical force and trigger a supernatural cataclysm. So you definitely don't want to just like throw rituals out there willy-nilly. You want to be able to succeed at these. So that's why I think they built in with group checks and reducing the cost and things like that. Now, when it's during a conflict, it adds that additional step. But essentially, you have to use the objective action to begin the ritual. Then you have to, again, determine the discipline, the area, and the potency. And then there's a clock that is started. And now that the clock is part of the scene, anyone that interacts with it can use the objective action to make progress towards that ritual happening. And once that clock is filled, then the ritual takes place, and it follows kind of all the same things as the ritual normally would do. And again, it can be either successful or backfire. So I don't know if I'll be messing around with rituals too much, but I could see how if you really want to play a spellcaster, that could be a pretty fun, chaotic, dynamic thing to maybe throw in there when people aren't expecting it. So that's all I'm going to say about magic and spells, but they seem really cool. There's tons of spells in here that all do their own things, and like we've said a few times, it might require a certain action or require a Fabula point or require something extra to do it. But the base of it is it just requires your mind points and a target or not. and then you just kind of follow those charts if you're using a ritual. That is the combat side of things. We can talk more about the other fun stuff, which is the gear and the economy and things you'll need other than just your spell casting. So
Yeah, no, I love what they did with rituals in this. As a some just they add like an extra bit of time to it, or hey, just require this one item and then you can do it. I love the nuance to it and how wide it can swing. Right, it's a really swingy. Most of this is pretty like on the rail, so to speak. Like they're like nothing crazy's going on, but the ritual is the one time where they're like, no, you could actually end. You can just wipe off a country, I
you know what
guess,
I
if
love
you mess
about
this.
it? I love that it makes spellcasters feel like spellcasters. It's not D&D where you ran out of spell slots or you're only limited to these three spells you know. Yes, you're limited to the spells you know, but the rituals, that's a way for your imagination to say, I want to use my magical power to do this thing and I'm spending this resource to do it. So I think a lot of cool things could be done with rituals. It's just again, it's a little bit too dangerous in my
Yeah,
opinion. But
definitely
I've never played,
don't
so I don't know.
bust out a ritual every combat, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
there when you
So
need it.
we'll have to actually play and test out the rituals, but they seem really cool the way they built them.
Yep. So getting into the gear and the economy itself, we'll start with the economy first. We've mentioned it a couple times, Zenit, and that is just the common currency in Fabula Ultima. It's kind of basically a gold coin. Region to region might change size, look, and all that, but Zenit is basically the gold coin of this, comparing to like things like Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. So to kind of say how much it is worth, the book kind of plays it out. Five's in it for good meal, ten's in it renting a room for the night in a town, and hundreds in it will get you something like a bronze shield. So kind of showing you what they are as far as value goes. There's also chart in there, which we'll get into a little bit, that kind of explains what you can purchase in town. But that's what you have for currency. And then as your equipment goes, you have four equipment slots. You have your armor slot, your main hand, your offhand, and an accessory. Each of those slots can hold one item, so you can only wear one armor. The armor is the entire set for this game, so you don't have, boots separate, pants separate, anything like that. You are just wearing plate armor, pretty common amongst the games, I think. And you have your main hand that is going to be whatever your primary, weapon or item that you're going to be using is. If it is two-handed, you cannot equip an offhand, but if it is a one-handed weapon, your offhand can hold any offhand equipment, primarily, things like a shield, things like that. And then your accessory is just that. It's an accessory. It could be a helmet, like in this game, could be an amulet, could be a ring. However, you can only have one item affecting you at a time. So uh, visually, you could say you're wearing it, but mechanically, only one accessory is going to be available to you at a time. Backpack basically holds everything else. Mechanically, there is no limit. It's all kind of up to the GM discretion on
Everyone has a
if
bag
you
of
can
holding.
carry every. Yeah, it's a bag of holding. Your GM decides everything that you are allowed to carry. If it's something that's particularly large or heavy, you may have to get things to transport that, which kind of leads into the services and transportation. The transportation side of it, you can purchase mounts in this game. You can also purchase vehicles. The way they look is kind of up to you. Again, there's a chart in the book for it that we'll throw up, but basically you have land mounts, water mounts, which are above water. Then you have submarine mounts and you have flying mounts. Same with the vehicles. You have those four basically categories. You get to kind of describe, or the GM describes what that looks like for the region that you're in, but you can basically get land mount, water mount, underwater mount, flying mount. Same with the vehicles. And then for the services, every town offers said services for like full rest and recharging your inventory. Your rest costs will be determined by the size of the town that you're in. You do get the same benefit no matter what. It just allows one person to rest for the night, but the cost does increase as you get into bigger cities. And then your traveling services. So if you don't necessarily want to spend the money, all the Zenit on, say, a terrestrial mount, which is 200 Zenit. If you're just starting off, maybe you just want to transfer yourself and not purchase the mount directly. For one day, it's 10 in it. So you do have a couple options as far as transporting and services go. Um, and I like it just because it's a nice way to actually sink money. I think some games forget that side of it. They give you all this gold, they don't necessarily tell you how to spend it. So you do have some big good money sinks here, which I like. And then your general equipment it's basically understood or assumed that you have the equipment that is appropriate to the identity of your character as well as the identity of a common adventurer. So things like ropes, torches, things like that, you don't need to track them. It's assumed that you have them, and it's assumed that you got more every time you visit into town. Maybe if you're on long stretches of, surviving, or you're just out in the wilderness and exploring, maybe you'll have to start tracking at GM description. But for the most part, it's just assumed you have those common everyday items that would make sense for you to have, right? Of course, for your adventurer thing, but maybe you're a sailor, you're gonna have things like that's where that kind of rope comes in. Like sailor probably has a rope. If you're a blacksmith, you probably have blacksmithing tools. It's assumed you have things like that. So, however, if it is equipment that may be common to someone else, but not necessarily to your identity or your adventuring party, the GM at their discretion can let you spend inventory points to have those things. However, they're going to be more expensive than normal, anywhere from 2 to 4 inventory points, depending on what it is. So it is possible for you to get more specialized equipment as you need it. It's just going to cost you a little bit. And it's ultimately up to the GM. You may not be able to get it. So just make sure you're tracking that. If it's something, we always ask your GM, hey, is this something I should probably make sure I have or not? Getting into the actual equipment itself, like your armor and your weapons. So you have first what's called your martial items. These are items that are indicated with a red star next to their name. If they have that red star, they just have class related restrictions. So certain classes will allow you to equip certain martial weapons and armor. So, say for instance, you are a dark blade, that allows you to equip martial melee weapons and martial armor. Or maybe you're a sharpshooter, and this gives you martial ranged weapons and martial shield. So you just need to make sure that it has that red star next to the equipment that you are using a class that can equip that specific martial item. That doesn't necessarily mean just because you are a martial class that you get all martial items. So there's a little bit of checking and verifying that you can use the equipment that you are trying to use. And then as far as your weapons go, they're fairly basic. They are laid out very efficiently, I think. They're going to tell you uh, the weapon's name, of course, whether it is a martial weapon, it'll have it next to the name of the weapon, how much it costs if you're trying to buy it, what check you need for its accuracy to see if you hit. So, say for the rapier, that's going to be dexterity, and insight +1. Then what you're going to do for damage. So, for again, the rapier, that's your high roll +6 physical damage. It's also going to tell you if it's one-handed, two-handed, whether it's melee or ranged, and if it has any special qualities to the weapon. But that's how you kind of read that chart. We'll throw one up there as well. But weapons are fairly simple, at least in the beginning when you're just dealing with basic weapons. You have your basic armors and shields. So, like I said, your armor is what's going to determine your initiative penalty if you have one. The heavier the armor, the more defense and stuff that it's granting, it's going to slow you down and just lower your initiative check. Your armors have a defense score and a magical defense score. Uh, for your light armors, the die size of your dexterity will determine your defense, and the die size of your insight will determine your magical defense for the most part. And then for your martial armor, it's usually a fixed amount. And like I said, they're going to be probably a little higher than normal, but it's because you're going to have a little bit of those penalties added onto them. But that is the equipment in a nutshell, right? You do have, potentially the option to make this equipment through, various long-term player projects, which I will let Brown finish out with on those.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you want to spend some Zenit, uh, start some projects. Because man, I'll show a couple as we talk through this, but there are some that take a lot of time investment, but a lot of money also. So definitely a lot of ways to spend some Zenit. So make sure you're earning enough to do these things. But yeah, so we'll start with projects. Again, there's a chart in the book, step by step process, right? So I love it. It's very easy to learn the system, I think, and also help educate people on the system. So with a project, there are 6 steps, right? You're gonna first describe the invention's effect, how it operates, what kind of energy it requires, basically, the concept of the item. Then on step 2, if it's complex enough, such as like a Magitech motorcycle equipped with a cannon, the game master is free to split that project into separate inventions, right? So you might have to make them both separately and then put some time to get them together. Step 3 is kind of like a ritual. You define the area, the potency, and if it's going to be consumable or if it's, you can use it more than once. Also, GM controls that as well, like everything in the game. If they are medium or higher potency, then the game master also has to make you require a special material or something to craft it. So again, you could plant those along the campaign that people can find to enable them to make these projects later, especially as your player characters go through the world. You're going to want them to feel like they're more capable of things. And so I think using projects from both the GM and the player character side is super cool to really streamline this game and make it keep it exciting and fun. Step 4 is you can negotiate a terrible flaw with the game master. So you might have to recharge this invention, or maybe it's unreliable or cumbersome, and it reduced the cost of the project by 25%. So basically, you can make it quicker, but not as efficiently. That is actually a step in here, which I love. You're like, yeah, I want to make this a little less effective, so save me some time. Step 5 is to complete the project. You must reach an amount of progress, and you must reach an amount of progress equal to 1 for every 100 zenit it costs. Basically, what that's saying is that depending on how much it costs, you have to do that many iterations of project working to make it a complete project. You can also get certain things here, such as +1 progress for every player character that works on that project, so multiple people can pitch in, just like the group check thing. And you get 1 extra progress for every player character with 1 or more levels in the Tinkerer class that worked on the project. So if you have Tinkerer or multi-class Tinkerer or someone around with that, that's definitely extra helpful if you want to build a lot of projects. And then step 6 is once you've reached the required amount that's created, you can generate more progress in a day than what is currently needed to complete the project. You may have it ready within a few hours instead. So you can literally just sit the whole day and do this project. Now there's a couple of charts that I'll show for the potency. So there are minor, medium, major, and extreme. Again, those exceed in costs, so it starts low and goes high. Then you have your area, so individual, small, large, or huge. That's the size of it. And then their uses, which are consumable or permanent, and that will add on to the time it takes to complete the project. There are also things you can do for damage and protection, for example. So if you created a minor project, then you can have 1 resistance. For example, you can make like a potion, a fire resist potion, and then you can drink that and have resistance to fire for 1 time. There's certain things like that in here. You also can increase the amount of protection. You can also determine the amount of damage or healing that a project would do. So if it's a level 5, for example, a minor amount of damage or healing would be 10, heavy amount would be 30, and massive amount would be 40. So they all scale depending on what you're making. There's also things like you can pay more Zenit to hire helpers. So if you don't have enough player characters, you can literally just hire people to work on the project with you. And again, you can get 1 additional progress per day per worker that you hired. And I kind of already touched on like certain materials and things that you can have be required to complete a project. But here's a couple I'll just throw up on the screen. Let's see which ones that I want to talk about. The Magitech suit. Thought that was pretty cool. So you can see here it takes 1,750 Zenit. You have to work on it at least 17 times, or have 17 people be successful at working on this, and you can choose to give it flaws. The other one that I thought might be useful in a lot of campaigns would be the underwater helmet, and that's really nostalgic for Final Fantasy type games, right? But this costs 1,000 Zenit and 10 progresses, but you can't add a flaw to this one, so you can't speed up this underwater helmet. So that's 2 just kind of interesting examples, and there's 2 pages in the book of examples, but like Fry said, you can really run with your imagination, and as long as the GM's down for it, who's going to stop you from making a gunblade? Because that's one of the first things I'm going to do.
Absolutely. I do want to too. I don't know if you had mentioned. I might have missed it, but the only caveat on 2 projects that I saw was at least the person starting it has to be a tinkerer. You have to have at least 1.
I
That's
did
their
not
like
say
ritual.
that. So yes.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, they so having more tinkers is great, obviously, but Not saying you should always have one, but if no one is a tinkerer and you're not sure what to play, taking 1 or 2 levels in tinkerer is not bad just to have access to the projects because I love this. I love money sinks. I love any game that, like, actually gives you a reason to spend a bunch of money. Like, if you're just sitting on thousands and thousands of Zenit, like,
What's it do?
yeah, if you're just looking at it head on, man, 6,000 Zenit for the discovery project they have, 60 progress required. But if you're just sitting on like 100,000 Zenit, you just hire like 30 helpers, and now you got it like that. So
Yeah, you can just become
throw
an
money at your
investor.
players.
Maybe you can hire a
Yeah,
tinkerer to start you a project.
that too. Hire a tinkerer.
Yeah, it does say. Thank you for catching that because it does say actually it relates it to spellcasters' ability to use ritual magic. Tinkerer's kind of special ability is to work on projects. So I don't know how I didn't say that, but that's a good catch. And definitely have at least one level in Tinkerer so you can make all these cool things. But that's going to wrap it up for chapter 3. That was a long one. I know there was a ton in this. I hope that you can find some of this information helpful, if not most of it.
Full
It's
chapter.
just, yes, it's so fun to continue exploring this system. There's so much, like when we first looked at this, I thought, oh, that'll be easy to cover this in a couple videos, but it goes pretty far for each thing. There's a step by step process. There's a chart for everything. Everything kind of ties in together, and I really like how the system kind of plays in itself to further the narrative and the role play. So keep an eye out for our next video. We're going to continue covering this, and we're going to be doing character creation, and it's going to be fun. We're going to cover what classes there are and build Tristan most likely in
Yeah.
the next video. So keep an eye out for chapter 4, and until next time, keep that shield wall strong.